last year the consumption demand, private sector consumption expenditure grew by 7.1%. Capital expenditure grew only by 4% and exports less than 1%. So, there is no sign of recovery as far or support to demand also coming from the central budget. But in fact, the size of the central budget is actually the lowest in the last 2-3 years. It is now about 12.6% of GDP, coming down from about 13.5%. So, the impact of the budget is therefore not going to be introduced directly through government intervention. It is not going to support additional demand nor a hike in the investment rate. So, most of that will have to now come from the stimuli that might be introduced and might affect the behavior of the private sector. That may be both domestic investors and external investors. Whether that will come will really depend on what would be the impact of the initiatives that have been announced in the budget for stimulating investment as well as demand from the private sector. There also, as far as the household sector is concerned, hardly any increase has been provided or relief has been provided through the tax exemptions or other provisions, such that we can expect some stimulation to household demand. So, most of it will have to come from the rest of the sector. So, there may be private investors or external investors. Whether that will have a bearing or not is something that we need to really question. So, I would say that in terms of my initial remarks, I see the ambition is very laudable. This is the right time to actually aim for a higher growth because inflation is coming down. But the direct support that is coming from the central budget is limited. The direct support that we can expect from the state budgets is also limited. So, really action moves to either monetary stimulus or to the private sector.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava. Dr. Bhalla, your views?
Look, there have been, evaluation of the budget. I think this budget should be seen in the context of both the economy as well as the other set of policy instruments that have been suggested and that are being enforced. The largest one, the most important one, are the recommendations of the Finance Commission. And there's a lot of confusion, etc., both in my minds and everybody else's minds, as to what this will mean for expenditures, total expenditures at the state level in things like education, things like health, etc. The opposition to the budget has been in the form of most prominently led by Mr. Chidambaram, and perhaps we'll get something from here, that listen, a lot of the welfare schemes or education, etc., the money has been cut, and that is clear, and 10, 15, 20%, these are not minor cuts, these are major cuts from the central level. Now, until we get clarity on what the states are going to do with that money, are they going to dig for gold underneath temples, or are they going to go into this stuff? We need to know, but it's highly unlikely in my view that things like education and health, some of these important areas, that the monies will be cut. So that's the first. So I do not think that there is a reduction in necessary expenditures in the health, education and welfare. Now, in terms of what I found was that there are a series of initiatives, policy initiatives taken by in the budget, which suggest that a definite change in the mindset, as well as a definite change in the thinking, and a definite change in the path towards or how you manage an economy. And most of them, if not all of them, have to do with, if you will, a lowering of the role of the state, lowering of, and you mentioned, actually I think The numbers, again, it's too quick to look at them because of all these issues, but I think I read there's the lowest share of government as a proportion of GDP in 25 years, not just the last 2, 3. And again, that is impacted by the Finance Commission report. Then there is, if you will, a lot of us had expected that there will be significant step forward on subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, food subsidies, etc. And again, the hint, there's more than a hint, but it's not there in the fine print as to how these subsidies will be replaced by the cash transfer scheme. But there is more than a hint that that is in the offing. So it is not there in black and white in this budget, but let me put it on record that I will be very, very surprised, and if you will, I'll be wrong in my assessment, if over the next 6 months there aren't concrete steps taken to replace, begin to replace food subsidies, etc., by cash transfer schemes. So I think the big idea, one of the big ideas, is that we are going to see a very different approach to poverty alleviation and transfers to the poor than has ever been practiced before in India. And one example of that is the Social Security scheme that was announced. We've always been talking about how we need to move towards poor, this, that, whatever, and I'm sure I'll hear that today as well. But, you know, why is it that the Indian government, no Indian government, and this includes Bajpayee, etc., moved an inch on providing social security for the poor? And again, they could have easily said that anybody, you know, if you were below the poverty line or whatever, that you will get free insurance or whatever it is, social security. And instead, and this I think is significant, okay, they said 1 rupees a month is all you need to pay in order to purchase. And this is the change in the mindset. That is, you know, perhaps over time they'll increase it. I think they will. But, you know, while it is for the first 2, 3, 4 years, you want to subsidize the poor. That is the responsibility of every government to, if you will, subsidize the bottom half of the population, and or bottom third, certainly the bottom third of the population. And this budget, by promising social security, which I don't think will be very hard to implement, so let's not say I have to wait and see when it's implemented. You know, if we can implement digging ditches a la Narega, we can certainly implement this. You need a lot less tools, and if you will, a lot less bureaucracy and a lot less corruption to bring this about. So I think the approach to this is commendable. Then then we come to the corporate tax reduction and what happens on the individual income tax side. There is a definite shift. There was no expansion of the tax limits for anybody, but there was, if you will, a significant increase in what you can deduct for investment purposes. So again, not for consumption purposes, but for investment purposes, and one can then work out how much the tax rate has gone down for the poor and for the middle class by increasing the allowance for investment purposes. This again is a very healthy sign. I think this will help increase tax compliance. Then, not last, but you know, an important message about the black money abroad. I think, you know, one can legitimately say how much will that achieve or not, but I think as part of the sentiment and, if you will, the punishment, we had that in all of the major things, that you need to have severe punishment, so some of the people have some fear. So I think it'll have some effect, but my personal view is that the black money, you need to do it domestically. It's not the foreign accounts. And that's where, if you will, I was disappointed in, that is the black money that comes out from property transactions. That's the major generator of black money in India.
That's
And
not going to be covered in this? As in, isn't there a
no, it's money,
imprisonment?
I do not know.
Okay, okay.
But I think it's money held abroad.
Money held abroad.
And money held abroad on which you haven't paid taxes. Remember, the RBI said,
Anything above 1 lakh has to be through check or something like that, right? So that
PAN
would
card,
bank
yeah.
card,
PAN card, yeah.
even
No,
domestic
that
would
is a
come under
different
it.
one. That's domestic purchases going forward.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
okay,
Sorry, yeah.
this is something.
Covering broad.
But I think, and I, you know, so if you want my disappointment in the budget, they could have easily said, and I think they should definitely do it in the next several years, is that we need to, like they've done on the wealth tax, let me use that as an illustration. And, you know, again, this is yet another example of how the mind has changed. And it did change with the Congress, UPA 1, when they moved or lowered the capital gains, short-term capital gains tax from 30%. And let me just ask, for the record, does anybody here know as to the maximum amount that the government had gained from the short-term capital gains tax prior to 2004-5? Okay, and remember the stock market had gone up a lot. Was 900 crores. And the same thing, I'm sure I'll look at it, wealth tax and capital. So therefore, a significant advance was made by Chidambaram in the 2004-5 budget by cutting the capital gains tax on short term from, if you will, 30% to 10%, which unfortunately then raised to 15%. But at the same time, the short-term securities transactions tax gets up 8,000, 9,000 crores before you say boo. So the wealth tax removal is precisely in that. You get nothing except the moral brigade feels happy, the same moral brigade that feels, you know, that women shouldn't lead their own lives, you know. So it's a reduction in the morality brigade that I think is very important. And you put a surcharge of 2% above 1 crore, and there's very little difficulty in collecting that. So let me just summarize. I think, look, there are a series of small, not so small initiatives. But the intent and the goal and the vision is very clear cut. If somebody, you may disagree with the vision, but if somebody says, I don't know where these guys are going, then I think they're objecting for the sake of objecting. It's very clear that where these guys are going is as far as corporate tax rates are concerned, they will be lowered. I think I will add that if corporate tax rates are lowered, individual peak tax rates will also have to be lowered. No announcement was made in there, but one can, I think, begin to expect that over the next 2-3 years, exemptions, some of the exemptions will go away. For example, one exemption is on transport allowance has been increased, this, that. All of these things are part of a set that will be eliminated, and with the promise of a lower tax rate. So, bottom line, I think this is the second most important budget since 1991.
Thank you. Laveesh. Also one question, I mean, let me interject one question which I don't think anybody is asking, is that, you know, the tax base, individual taxpayers has remained more or less the same for the last 10 years or something, right?
No. I have explicitly done numbers on this, and today I think it's like 20%, if not more, of the people who are eligible. So 20% of the workforce outside of the rural areas, and that's something else I need to talk about later on. But anyway, let me just give you the numbers, which is about 80 million. So 80 million people are eligible to pay tax. Whether they give the tax or not, separate issue. 10 years ago, it was about 40 million, 45 million. So the tax base has really broadened, which is why direct taxes have done phenomenally well, along with the corporate tax. The second question related to that, what's been the story on compliance? So the tax base has gone up, are we complying more? and the compliance ratio, average compliance ratio, has gone up to about something like 55% from something like 30-35% 10 years ago. But that still means you're not getting about half the taxes that you should be collecting because of non-compliance. So the base has expanded, compliance has expanded, but we started off from such a low collection ratio of 20%, 15%, that is now up to something like 55%. And most of the rich pay taxes, and most of the people below 7.5 lakhs of income pay taxes because they are salaried. It's the businessmen
and the professionals.
The professional businessmen. The businessmen who comes under corporate tax, they pay taxes. It's your doctors and your lawyers and your accountants and your stockbrokers, and these are the guys who don't, and where we need efforts to. And they are the ones high income. It's not the poor, it's not the rich.
Laveesh.
Yeah. So I'll just like to just set the
And the poor, sorry, and the poor amongst those who are taxpayers, not the poor don't. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to set the base of this government, which has been professing and generally regarded to have a very long vision. And I think that's something very, very important for this. The Prime Minister and his other ministers in the cabinet have made it very clear that they are not looking at short term. They have a 20-year or a 10 or 20-year agenda. And I think that's extremely important because that is precisely what India requires at this point in time. So whatever we do, we need to judge the budget from that. I mean, is this budget taking us towards something which is a 20-year goal? So I'll try and do that. So first, if you have a long-term vision for India, the first thing you need to do is level with the people. So the budget has to be a credible piece of a credible document. And that's something which was not really true till even the last budget, and of course towards the last part of the UPA years, there was a lot of fudging of the numbers and so on. So I think just on that account, this budget, at least till now, whatever I have looked at, is a very, very transparent document. And I think the government needs to be congratulated on this. I mean, the one thing that you need to do, whatever be the other numbers, is that you need to level and you need to do it honestly. And whatever you say should be the real picture. So I do like the growth projections, the revenue projections, and I think they are based on reality and they are not really dreamt up, which they were till now. So I think that's one very big step. It's correcting an imbalance that had happened over the last few years, and you could not achieve anything else without first doing that. So that's one. I think the second really important part of this is this movement towards greater decentralization, the fiscal federalism. Obviously, it is the Finance Commission that had set the stage for this, but the positivity with which this government has embraced those recommendations, both in letter and in spirit, and their statements and the way that they have looked at it, is, I think, phenomenal. I would not have expected any government to have, imbibed these recommendations so quickly and so wholeheartedly. So I think that's again a phenomenal thing for India, and again, full marks and perhaps more than full marks to this government for doing this. The third part, and I think Dr. Bhalla has already mentioned, is this whole framework for a social security net. Now, I don't see specifics the way Dr. Bhalla mentions it in this budget, but I do see the movement as something which is very important. So the fact that you're dictating a vision for yourself and for the country, I think is a very important thing. We do need a single social security net, and the major reason is because of the duplication of subsidies and welfare mechanisms that we have. We need to correct it, and there will be a lot of saving that will come in eventually when this gets implemented. Just purely on the statement front, this whole single social security net is a great move by this in this budget. So these are the three great things about it. Apart from this, what I see is a budget which is fairly moderate. It's not great on any of the respects the way I would like to see it. A lot of statements are made which will pan out as we go along, and they are to be welcome, no doubt, but we need to see the specifics as we go along. The specifics that we see out here are not for are not very different from what the UPA was doing. And here I'm mentioning on the specifics of the kind of taxation changes that are being done, or for that matter, the kind of expenditure allocations that are being done. Remove the fiscal federalism issue, which I think Dr. Bhalla has already mentioned. You remove that part of it, and I will mention some of those. So first, public sector investment. Now, this is important because there is definitely an investment slowdown, and we need to get out of it. It's very critical. However, we are doing it through a public sector, and I do not see any reason why the public sector would do a better job of infrastructure investment than, let's say, the NHAI was achieving directly through the private sector contracts. That's just one example. And these are not PPPs, it's just simply contracting out many of the infrastructure projects. There's no reason necessary to do it through the public sector unless you are UPA-esque. I mean, it's a very Nehruvian way of doing things. Second, I don't see anything out here which will say that, yes, this is how we are going to impact subsidies. Fine, we've decided that the Aadhaar card will be the way forward for India, the direct benefits transfers will be the way forward. But in this particular budget, I do not see how are the fertilizer subsidies going to be addressed, how are the food subsidies going to be addressed, how are the fuel subsidies going to be addressed. I really don't see much happening there. And if you don't address these three elements, then you've automatically slowed down the fiscal consolidation, movement towards fiscal consolidation. So I think there is something which this budget definitely needed, but not moving and not even making statements on this is I think a major flaw. Very, very UPA style. I do not see any movement towards improvement in the efficiency of the government. How is the government going to become more efficient in going about getting better implementation? The Prime Minister can make only so many phone calls. At the end of the day, you need a much more efficient mechanism of delivery. And I do not see much happening on that front. And I'll give you one example, 20,000 crores given to the Niti Aayog for getting around some specific projects that may be stuck. But I do not see 20,000 given to the Niti Aayog to improve the state's ability to deliver all those extra funds that they are going to get. Okay? And I think that's one very major flaw in this. If we have to improve implementation, we have to allocate more funds towards implementation. I don't see that happening. I do believe that the health education expenditure cut is actually not a cut, and no one is going to cut it. It's just going to happen that the states will have to bear a larger burden, as they should. And so I really do not agree to that criticism that health and education expenditures have been cut. It's just something that's a transfer to the states. I feel that overall, just on the allocation on the expenditure side, this budget could have done much more than it has. And that's something that is a major weakness. Obviously, they didn't, but you wouldn't if you want to spend more. I mean, the point is not about not having the money. The point is about what are the statements that you're making right now. Okay, and already the deficit figure has been stretched a bit to put in investment, and so there are enough ways of handling these issues if you really want to. Anyway, on the taxation side, I'm not sure on the deduction side. So yeah, we'll have fewer deductions, but what kind they will be, we really don't know. On the personal income tax, we have actually increased the deductions. So on one hand, the statement is towards lower deductions, but actually you're giving more on the personal income tax side. So I'm not sure whether what the statements are being said are the ones that are being followed. So there's that disjoint between the two. So there are a couple of things which I didn't really like, and I think those are very, very important. Every problem, there will be a new law. A new law is the last thing that you want. So in this government, again, goes back the NSE UPA style. This is a problem, we will have a new law. Please, most of these problems can be corrected without any new laws.
Which one are you referring to?
All of those. So you just go through the budget, there are at least a mention of 7 or 8 new proposed laws, at least. Yeah, new laws. Yeah. On the financial side, mostly. Okay, so you need to just go over the number of new laws, and someone in the government, perhaps the Niti Aayog, should take a marker and mark out all the new laws that are being talked about and eliminate them from this thing. Or Panagria, I mean anyone can do it.
Vivek has
Okay.
studied this and recommended
Yeah,
the elimination
the
of
same
overdraft.
style continues. The STT, we haven't gotten away with it. With the securities
It
transaction
gives you
tax.
7,000 crore.
So you have to eliminate it. It's a
know.
stupid tax to have, right? So this whole thing that the government is saying all these nice things, but when they are going about doing it, they're following the UPA. So I would really like the people who are drafting to actually read what the finance minister and the prime minister are saying. And I think that's when this budget will become really great. So with that, I'd like to end. One last point I'd like to say. Simplification and rules. You create a better environment for investment by simplification, not by creating more rules. So for instance, if I want to get money back from abroad, by saying that I'm going to go after the people, I will not get it back. It will not happen. If I want to collect more taxes, by saying that you have to give your PAN number for every 1 lakh check, believe you me, you will put people in the cash domain rather than get them into the banking domain. These rules go absolutely against this whole principle of trying to get people into the organized domain. They are going to draw people out into the disorganized. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Rajeev Gowda. Rajeev,
Yeah, copy.
your views.
Thanks. Last time, some of us met before the budget, and we explored many of the things that the government could possibly do. Well, I think I speak for a large number of people in India who are let down by this government's budget because they had an extraordinary confluence of factors that gave them an opportunity to do something dramatic and transformative. And the low inflation rate, low oil prices, a mandate in the lower house, things like that. This was a very good time to do something significant. Now, when I talk about significant, I'm not talking about just random measures, but deep structural challenges. For example, the recapitalization of banks. We want infrastructure, and this budget does address infrastructure. But even the economic survey, they talk about a huge percentage of GDP, 7.5 or so, stuck in infrastructure projects, right? So this is probably an area where much more attention, much more allocation of resources could have actually yielded a much bigger bang, right? And that we see much less attention to that. And with the other part, the bank recapitalization would have got the banks more interested in lending once again. And there's been a market slowdown in those sectors. And lots of factors for that having to do with economic cycles, international, what shall we say, markets slowing down, everything sort of coming down, our own experience with PPP, things like that. The other sector where I thought we would have seen much more is in housing and construction, right? That is an example of something where you have much, very significant multiplier impacts, and that you could have seen much more coming out of that. Now, the part that really concerns me is what are we doing to our human component of our future, right? So we need people who have health and education and social security and a whole bunch of other aspects. And here, while all of us are looking at these transfer of funds to the states and things like that, Mr. Chidambaram makes the point that actually we have not, that overall transfer remains at 62% of revenues. And so when the finance minister says we are not going to have to do this, it's going to the states as part of that 42% untied funds, he says actually that there is no increase in the total amount of money that is in the hands of states. So if that is the case, if we are cutting central expenditure on many of these dimensions, whether it is programs focused on the Rashtriya Kisan Vikas Yojana, food security, the SC sub-plan, the tribal sub-plan, health, children, minorities, water, whatever, right? And all these crop insurance, all these places you see a cut, and everyone has assumed that that cut will be made up by this transfer to the states. Well, from what we are, as we sort of pay more attention to the detailed numbers, it appears that we may have erred on that front. We may have been mistaken, and that these are actual cuts. And that is something that would be very, very worrisome, because on the one hand, you're talking about extending Social Security and insurance and pensions, which is just a very fantastic continuation. You know, Laveesh kept talking about continuation of UPA. Well, one continuation of UPA here that we see is our UPA concern for the poor, for the social safety nets that we need to create, and you see that movement now in terms of this, in terms of pension and insurance and things like that. Now, the issue is, we are if we are going to neglect public goods in a variety of domains, then who is going to fill that gap, right? If education comes down, if healthcare comes down, are you going to have people spend even more out of their own pockets in the private sector, saying that there's some insurance that they have? I'm not at all sure that this is going to lead us in the direction that we would actually want to go. The other factor that we tend to, that doesn't seem to get enough play right now is the increase in service tax, right? Our economy is substantially, 50-60% services, and service tax has gone up from 12.36 to 14, and now with this talk about a couple more cesses, we don't know how much will actually get into every single transaction that most of us, across the board, participate in. If that actually become, there's a logic to that, of course. Whatever that GST rate is going to be, ultimately you're going to see service tax, excise, all those converge. And so, I mean, if we haven't arrived at that, why do it now? Okay, let's do it all at the same time. There's a logic to that. Anyway, if you're increasing this at this point, then there are two factors that it will have, two impacts it will have. One is a regressive impact. It will affect everybody in society, including the poor and the middle class. And that's the last thing that we want right now. And even more, it will fuel inflation as well, especially if those cesses are also added. Why, at a time when inflation is coming down, do we want to do something of that sort and send the wrong signals to the RBI and others? Now, some of the other things that they are investing a lot more in is this JAM notion of this financial inclusion and the Aadhaar and the benefits transfer and moving to mobile and RuPay and all that sort of thing. So these are all positive measures. There's another. I can make positive statements about the NDA. I'll mention one more. This concept of a plug-and-play power project, right? I actually like that because so far we haven't had that. We have people getting into big investments and then finding themselves stuck because of possibly land, possibly consent, various other factors, which all have their place in a democratic economy and society. Now, if you can come up with more of these kinds of initiatives where you've taken care of everything, then of course you'll be able to ease business, increase the ease of doing business on large-scale projects and things like that. So I'd like to see this actually becoming a reality. There's some other worries that I have. One worry, of course, is when we have moved towards somehow or the other committing to those deficit targets and holding on to them, why postpone, right? You could have said, we're talking about credible commitments. Why postpone? There's a lot of, there's this old phrase, kal aana, come tomorrow. And so there are a lot of come tomorrow, come next year in this, whether it is, whether it's corporate tax cut, whether it is, meeting those targets, everything. So why push everything, 1 year into the future? And then I had some concerns over, what shall we say, this issue of the actual performance, right? So when there is a talk that so much money is being allocated to Manrega, and in fact, if we have tax buoyancy, we'll give you more, right? Prime Minister calls it a monumental failure on the part of the UPA. The rest of the world says it's made a huge impact in terms of alleviating poverty. And Mr. Jaitley, says that he'll give it more money. So there's a certain amount of confusion, but more money for that is certainly okay. The issue really is when you look at the numbers, right? There was so much allocated, but only half of it actually went to the Rural Development Ministry, and even less reached the states, right? So when the actual transmission of these resources comes about, you're seeing a very different picture on the ground than what is being portrayed in the speech. And so that creates an optical illusion, which is not an appropriate way for a budget to go about, especially when all of us, I think, want much more clarity and transparency and things of that sort. I'm not commenting about previous budgets, I'm just talking about this one. The other issue, of course, is what is this strategic disinvestment? What was disinvestment all this while? Just playful disinvestment? Now we're going to be strategic about it? What are we talking about? And if we're going to do that, then what are the projections, and could that have been used for recapitalizing banks? Some of it has gone to an infrastructure fund, which I think even I'd sort of pushed that last time when we met. So all those are good things. Then what happened to smart cities? What happened to bullet trains? All those sorts of things that were very eye-catching earlier. And the last point, of course, is why do we need this mega bonanza to corporates? The effective tax rate for corporates is apparently already just about 23-24%. And so given that, why do we need to bring that down when we are otherwise talking about having a challenge meeting fiscal targets, revenue targets? So that's there are people who playfully say it is dhan vapsi to the people who invested in the party's campaign, but let's not go there. The basic thing is, So these are sort of broad pictures. I'm really concerned about where this, if you're looking at the long-term direction is towards worsening equality, worsening the opportunities for those at the bottom of the pyramid. None of these things are things that India can afford at this time. It's setting us up for tremendous challenges going forward.
Mr. Sinha?
Yeah, okay, great. So coming in after 4 distinguished economists, I'll give a slightly more practical view from a corporate standpoint, and overall from a general, listening to the budget and trying to figure out which direction this government was taking us into. And I think that the overall context here is that we are looking at a cyclical upturn that is in any case happening, right? The macroeconomic numbers have moved in a positive direction, and therefore the government had some leeway. But I think, as one of the people earlier said, that I don't think that this government is impelled by a necessary sense that everything has to get done right now, right? I think they do believe that they have a longer term runway, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, is a different matter. But certainly even 4 years more is a fairly long period of time. And the second thing is that I think this budget has to be seen in the context of all the other things that this government is doing currently. And it should not be seen only in isolation. And therefore, in that sense, I think the Finance Minister also said that, look, reforms is not just a one-time event, it's a 365-day event. And I think, having said that, of course, I think there was a need for the government, and I think they felt it this time, that they had to lay out a longer-term vision roadmap as well as to where they were trying to head towards. And I think if you look at the first part of the speech, there were some statements to that effect about what thrust the government wanted to give and what were their areas of focus. But I think if you look at the overall budget as sort of in sum, to me it appears that it's a fairly balanced budget, okay? And it's somewhat growth positive. And I don't say it's massively growth positive because, to me it's just one step in a longer program of the government, and we have to see what else they end up doing along with this budget to see where we actually finally end up at on the growth side. But I think there is the other big thing that I'd like to say is that nobody has anything very negative things to say about it. And past budgets have very often been subject to a lot of criticism. And notwithstanding Mr. Gowda's attempts to be somewhat critical, I think, most people are struggling to say this was really, really bad. And I'm not trying to, of course, take on his position or anything. But I think that, so the question therefore is, it's not a bad budget, it's mildly positive, but could it have done more? And were people expecting more? And unfortunately, the answer to those questions is yes, people were expecting more. And therefore, there is also at some level a mild sense of disappointment that could we have done more. And I think different people from different sectors or representing different areas all felt that their sector, their area probably needed to have something allocated to it. And that did not really materialize. So there weren't any big dramatic tax cuts either for corporates or for individuals. There weren't any big tax increases. There wasn't any reduction in MAT. So none of those things happened. And so therefore, when you sort of look at that, you wonder what was the real thrust that this government is trying to give in this budget. And so when I was sitting here and listening to everybody, I was just trying to write down what are the things that the government did that sort of allow us to look at the overall not disappointing budget and sort of add on to that and sort of start from that not disappointing base level. And when I looked at it, there are actually quite a few things that they have done. And I think therefore the focus has been more around improving the overall economic environment in terms of the ease of doing business or in terms of providing basic security to sort of the common man. And I think that's where the thrust has been. And if I just sort of go through some of those issues that they've looked at, for example, and I'll just in no particular order read them out, the bankruptcy law. I think to me that's a very big thing. The fact that we've seen messy sort of breakups and unwinding of some of the corporates, particularly in the airline space, and it takes a long time. And that then prohibits banks from actually moving their assets faster, unwinding their NPA positions and so on. So that I think is a fairly big move forward. And couple that along with that, in fact I'll talk about that later. The second big thrust to me has been on infrastructure. And this creation of the National Infrastructure Investment Fund with the 20,000 crore equity corpus can be levered up at least 8 to 10 times and make almost 200,000 crores of extra funds available for investment. And that's a lot. That's a fairly large sum. Now, of course, it will take time to get implemented and all of those things. But certainly once it does get activated, that's going to add a lot of extra funding availability into infrastructure. They've also allocated 50,000 crores to roads and railways specifically. That, of course, will probably get implemented through government agencies. Then they've talked about, in PPPs, for example, trying to take away certain of the risk areas which have bedeviled the sector so far and have prevented private investment from really going forward. And they've tried to move that into the sovereign sort of domain. And so that's a big benefit. And then they've tried to address the whole issue of REITs and InvITs, which again creates more liquidity in the system. So on the infra side, I think the focus has really been, while sector by sector sort of reform continues through the ministries, I think at the budget they've tried to create more liquidity and put that to play, which hopefully then allows us to have more financing of infra going forward. And that can actually, given all the much larger multiplier effect and so on, have a much more significant impact in the economy as a whole. Other things that they've looked at, entrepreneurship and innovation. I think that's an area where they've actually allocated some money to create an innovation fund. I think the 1,000 crore has been sort of set aside for an entrepreneurship fund. They've given some money to Niti Aayog to look at the innovation aspects. So I think, and along with that, when you look at the fact that they've also, the FM talked about trying to make starting new companies a lot easier. And so therefore there is a strong thrust towards trying to encourage a much broader set of new corporates to come into play, because I think there's a recognition that it's ultimately the smaller companies that will, once they get created, create much more jobs and be much more broad-based over time. So they've tried to put some effort behind that. Then on the overall sort of the social security side, the whole concept of JAM, where I think they're trying to make subsidy transfers a lot more direct and a lot therefore more efficient. How that plays out again we have to see, but certainly the thrust is there on that. And then the creation of the social security scheme. I think that is also a very significant step forward, because as somebody was saying earlier, none of the governments have really focused on that. And I think this government is taking the view that they do want to provide at least a basic minimum in terms of accident cover, health cover, as well as pension benefits to everybody in the economy, and at some very sort of low cost levels. Again, we have to see how that pans out. But one other benefit of that will be that it's also going to create a much higher savings rate over time, because people are then going to have to start investing in some of these insurance and pension schemes. And that ultimately will also create more investment sort of corpuses to invest in, whether it's long-term asset creation or short-term asset creation. So it just makes the overall economy a little bit more financial in nature over time. Then they talked about bank autonomy, which they've talked about in the past as well, but they talked about the creation of this bank autonomous board as a first step in that direction, talking about small recapitalization of banks. Black money was referred to, the doing away of wealth tax, fairly big step. And then a couple of other things on which again look at overall streamlining the general efficiency of the economy. One was trying to encourage manufacturing by removing the inverted duty structure. So they've tried to basically sort of right some of the old wrongs and try to create a better environment for manufacturing. Secondly, strategic disinvestments. The strategic of that refers to selling companies wholesale, potentially, as opposed to the fact that it's a strategic activity. And so introducing that into the budget or into the sort of the political lexicon, as it were, however quietly, and of course I'm sure Mr. Gowda will have something to say about that, is to me another step. Now of course at this point they've talked about strategic disinvestments only of loss-making public sector units, but at least that philosophy perhaps gets in there. Now at the subsequent clarification I heard that they were strategic in their mind still meant that the government would own 51%. So I still, there's still some confusion about that. And then of course giving a specific timeline for GST, I think that's another fairly big thing. So when you add up all of these things, and I'm sure I haven't even covered all the things that were talked about, but when you just look at all of these things, there's a very clear thrust around trying to make the economy more efficient, make it easier for people to operate, whether it's large corporates or new corporates, whether it is the common man. One thing I don't particularly agree with is the issue of actually increasing MAT. So to the point of the reduction in the corporate tax rate, actually it's not a reduction, and I think people are taking it amiss. I think the reality is that what the FM said is that the effective tax rate today is 23% in India, but because the headline rate is 30% plus, therefore foreign investors, when they come in to invest in India, compare the headline rate to rates available in other parts of Asia, which are in the early 20s, and they just say, look, this is a worse destination. Whereas actually the government also doesn't benefit because we only get 23%. So therefore it's kind of a lose-lose situation in all counts. So his philosophy behind that is to actually reduce the headline rate, but at the same time remove exemptions and get the headline rate to become closer to the effective rate over time, right? So actually there isn't going to be any great windfall in this for corporates. They're actually going to be removing exemptions and at the same time reducing the tax rate, the headline rate, but net is going to be a wash as far as any benefits to corporates is concerned. So what we are therefore left with as corporates is really the 2% increase in surcharge, which also is applicable to MAT, and so therefore our overall tax rates have actually gone up by about 0.6% to 1%, which coupled with the increase in service tax of almost 1.7% is a minor increase in the overall taxability of the economy. But 1%, 1.5% is nothing that sort of gets anybody sort of really out of shape. And so people haven't really objected to it. But and at least for individuals, at least that has been sort of cushioned because they've got more deductions and so on. And so therefore at some level for an individual it's coming out flat. For corporates there is a higher tax rate to be paid, not a huge amount, but there still is. So I think that to me was the only slight negative in the whole thing. But I think by and large it's a fairly balanced budget, as I said earlier, and the focus has really been around taking this theme of the ease of doing business forward. The only one other thing I'd like to add is that they also for the first time talked about a carbon tax, and there's an explicit commitment in this budget to greening our growth going forward, and that to me is positive given the sector that I represent. And so therefore in fact the clean energy cess has gone up to 200 rupees from 100, with a roadmap perhaps to taking it further. And there was of course operationalizing of, or at least some talk about a Swachh Bharat cess as well, which is then meant to fund all the Swachh Bharat activities that are happening. So I think in some senses the budget was tying in a lot of different things that the government has been talking about, ease of doing business, Swachh Bharat and all of those things. And so to me it's a step in the right direction. It's not something that anybody, as I said, can point to and be massively unhappy with. If anything, people should be happy that it's taking the government's path forward in the right direction.
Mr. Venkatraman, your thoughts on the budget?
Thank you very much. And after coming after a distinguished panel of economists, I'll just try to give a market's perspective of what the market observers are thinking about the budget. First and foremost, I think the markets had huge expectations on the budget, and there was a lot of hype and expectations built around it, especially on the back of what the finance minister had said last time, that he didn't have adequate time to prepare for his maiden budget. So in the next budget, he's going to announce a set of bold reforms 2.0 kind of thing. So to that extent, I think there was some kind of disappointment, but that is not to do with the budget itself, but because of the burden of expectations that most people were carrying. I would, from a market's perspective, most people tend to look at in the budget in 2 or 3 big buckets. The first bucket is what relates to fiscal deficit and subsidies. In our opinion, although the fiscal deficit target has been postponed by a year or so, but that is not such a big issue given the fact that the government needs to kickstart the economy. Although all the macroeconomic parameters seems to be showing some kind of upswing, but the economy is clearly not out of the woods. So to that extent, I think the minister has taken a very pragmatic step in delaying this fiscal deficit target instead of sticking to it without taking cognizance of the overall circumstances. The second point is related to subsidies. I think this government is now clearly having a change in the mindset when it comes to dealing with subsidies. And I'll just repeat what Dr. Bhalla just said in the beginning, that making the poor person pay ₹1 for insurance itself is a big thing. ₹1 per month is a very small amount, but it is a big mindset change, because previously all the governments were much more used to giving things for dole or for free. So that, I think the government in the next 6 months, 12 months will take concrete steps to rationalize subsidies, and better targeting of subsidies, especially with the acronym which is JAM. So I'm sure they will make sure that people pay for JAM instead of expecting JAM for free. On the big thing is that I think GST is a big positive, and instead of saying that we are going to have one more round of meeting, discussion, deliberations, the date has been announced for GST rollout, and that will be an extremely big and positive step for the economy. Coming to the taxation front, the service tax increases from 12.4% to 14% is a small amount. The corporate tax reduction, at least the clarity of reduction of corporate tax from 30% to 25% in a phased manner is a good thing, because the effective tax rate in the country was already down to 23-24%. So might as well get rid of exemptions and agree for a lower tax rate. But what is better announced, which is not covered, is simply because I think he's talking about a much conducive tax environment. So, so if you know that there is a lot of power or discretion in the hands of the assessing officer, and he decides whether this exemption is allowed or not. So by getting rid of exemptions, at least it's making an environment of quote-unquote non-adversarial regime of tax compliance, and I think that will increase compliance in a significant manner. And that's a step in the right direction. GAR, postponement of GAR to all transactions after April 1 is again a step in the right direction, because everybody wants a predictive tax environment, and nobody wants files to open for transactions done 3-4 years ago. The other big thing which is quite positive is about the whole push on infrastructure and the plug and play model. I think many a time if you talk to corporates, most of them have invested in money and then waiting for clearances. Plug and play will at least remove that uncertainty and make sure that private sector investments in infrastructure again comes back. Overall, I think the entire message given in this budget is they want to take steps to make India an easier place to do business with, and that is good, because the ability of government to spend and kickstart and drive the economy is coming down. And we discussed that the size of the budget this time has come down, not only for the last 2-3 years, but over the last 25 years. So clearly, the balance of power is shifting more towards the corporates, more towards SME, more towards individual. And hence, the government's role is much more towards making India a better and easier place to do business. And I think that's a big positive. Coming to what will happen in the markets, I just want to leave one last thought. Typically, markets reflect corporate earnings and earnings growth. So last year, we had a stellar performance in the market. The markets returned almost 40% if you take the last 1 year. So going ahead, I think this year 40% will be a very stretched target. I think it will be difficult to beat. Returns will be in line with earnings growth, and that slowly and steadily will come back. So this year, I think the market should give about 15 to 17% returns, which is broadly in line with the earnings growth, and the re-rating story of India is more or less over. So overall, I think the budget did not live up to the expectations, simply because expectations were too big, and it's a very pragmatic, practical and growth-oriented budget.
Dr. Ranade?
I just want to make a couple of preamble points. You know, if you heard Shekhar Gupta, he said that he was waiting for some critics to give it a rating of 11 out of 10. And that pretty much sums up the, I think, background to this budget, that there was such huge expectations. In fact, I read another comment which said that while everybody gave it 8 out of 10, the minimum that was expected to be given as 10 out of 10. So that is the problem of Mr. Jaitley, that the burden of expectations was very huge, and it's just simply not possible to meet those kind of expectations. Secondly, I must say that there's been a great alignment between the economic survey vision and what was in the budget, in the sense that the economic survey had made it amply clear that this is not a roadmap. I mean, you don't expect a big bang reform. In fact, this is the first year of a 5-year journey, or if not longer. So in that sense, I'd like to call it a choti choti bang bang, like chiti chiti bang bang, choti choti bang bang budget, with lots of stuff, good stuff, but lots of stuff to object to. A standard criticism, of course, as you know, is that there's been a missed opportunity. So that list is much longer, but that criticism applies to pretty much any budget. So we'll not go there for the timing. So let me just quickly say what is good. These are all small points. As I said, my overall comments are in the spirit of choti choti bang bang. So JAM is obviously a game changer. It was referred to by the economic survey, and the budget is using that concept of triangulating between these three sources: the direct transfer through bank accounts and a triangulation of identity through Aadhaar and mobile. In some way, actually, it's a good thing because it validates the concept of Aadhaar, which is now almost, I believe, 10 years old. It's been discussed for almost 10 years. And this kind of an application is an excellent opportunity. The other big excellent opportunity initiative that's happening is connecting Aadhaar with the voter ID, which the Election Commission has also announced. The second good thing about it is Safresi. You know, there was a big anomaly in the act which gave banks the right, the lenders' rights were strengthened in 2003, but that was not extended to non-bank finance companies. And non-bank finance companies, as you know, they reach where banks cannot reach. So in that way, it's a good thing that at least the larger NBFCs have been brought on par. The third positive thing is for SMEs, lots of good things for SMEs. But I like the fact that an electronic marketplace for receivables, so that they can trade, it's called loan discounting or factoring. Now this is a concept which was been pushed by RBI for some time, and it's now got a formal blessing. It's a positive for SMEs because SMEs often get quite squeezed between their customers and the market. Fourth positive thing already mentioned is this first step towards a universal social security. That's potentially a very big thing, but this is the first small step. The fifth very good thing, which I personally liked a lot, is one of the things we have been concerned about is the alarming decline in the financial savings of the country. And a big culprit for that, I believe, is gold. So this gold monetization, I think, is a good thing. And I hope they will be able to float this gold instrument or gold substitute paper de-linked, unlike an ETF, an exchange traded fund. This is not backed by any metal. It is simply fiat paper, like Kisan Vikas Patras. Fifth, as I think Sumant referred, correction for inverted duties and CVDs. This was there again in the economic survey. I find a lot of stuff which was in the budget was already discussed in the economic survey. So after a long time, we are seeing a good connection between the vision of the economic survey and the budget. So this was an anomaly, again, existing for many years. I don't know why it took so long, but it's been at least addressed. Again, the 1 rupee health insurance, let me point out, it's not about pricing insurance. I think the hidden benefit is that it's like during Mr. Chidambaram's time, we had a cash withdrawal tax. The real purpose, I think, is to get an accurate electronic database, meaning even if you pay 1 rupee insurance 1 rupee premium towards health insurance, once you capture the data and make it all electronic and consolidate it, that is a huge benefit. Right now, if it's free health insurance, then you can't keep track of the data and track the beneficiaries. So those are a few of the positives. Some of the negatives are public sector banks undercapitalized and not adequately provided for. I think one of the big challenges facing the country today is the crisis in banking, especially stressed assets. And it's not because of willful defaulters, it's because of a huge bottleneck, if I can call it, between the consortium lenders and between the various states of NPAs. And if you have 20 guys sitting around the table and all of them agree to a CDR, the actual implementation takes several months, by which time the near NPA becomes a total NPA. I think Mr. Gowda is on the board, so he'll understand this. So what was a very big missed opportunity is not only providing capital, but empowering, let's say, a 3-member committee, which is outside the finance ministry, to say, give them a 200-day or a 100-day timetable to sort out the top 200 NPAs in the country. It's a very simple thing. If an empowered committee can do, they should not report to any secretary, joint secretary. They should report directly to the finance minister. Give them 100. I mean, that's really sorely needed. I think this was something that the finance minister could have done. Then, of course, the third negative thing is fiscal slippage. I think there was no need. He very gamely and bravely accepted the target of 4.1% in the July budget. In that same spirit, he could have adopted the 3.6%, and certainly with the oil bounty available, this was doable. So this sends a wrong signal, according to me. And in fact, the revenue deficit, or the corrected revenue deficit, actually has gone up. So I don't know why there was this fiscal slippage. It gives a very, very wrong signal. In fact, this is in light of when they're asking the Reserve Bank to be responsible for inflation targeting, but they're not accountable for their own fiscal slippage. And without fiscal consolidation, just inflation targeting is just a hopeless objective. Then, of course, fertilizer, nothing done on. This was a smart card initiative, I think, started about 7-8 years ago. Surely we could have, in the spirit of JAM, started doing it on fertilizer subsidy. So not done. Then overall, I think overall the budget provides a little bit of inflationary signals. For example, there's a hike in the coal freight, in the railway budget. There is an increase in the service tax rate. There's an increase in the various cesses. I call it a pool of cess rather than cesspool. So there are 3 kinds of cesses. There's a clean energy cess, there's a Swachh Bharat cess, there's a road cess. And I think all of it, if you add up, it is definitely inflationary. So I don't know, again, in light of the oil bounty, what was the need to keep increasing the cesses? Then second last point is, I think Mr. Gowda referred to it, that health spending, this has been pointed out again and again, that India's health spending as a proportion of GDP is only 1%, whereas in China it is 3%, public health, and in the US it is about 8.5–9%. So we have a lot to catch up, and I think health spending has actually, it's stayed the same or maybe gone down a bit. And last point is about this plan versus non-plan. I think this was again referred that since the Planning Commission is being sort of revamped or shut down, why do we still have the plan versus non-plan approach? They had plenty of time, almost 9 months since August, to have worked on this and make it like in the proper capex versus revenue spending rather than plan versus non-plan. But overall, I think it achieves this objective of trying to balance 3 competing goals: to provide a growth impetus, to give some fiscal signals, if not 3.6, at least 3.9, going down to 3, and providing for infrastructure and social sector. So these are not necessarily very contradictory goals, but it does a fair job, at least for this year. And of course, this is to be seen as the first budget of perhaps a 5-year journey. Thank you.
Mr. Venkatraman needs to leave, I think. So quickly, some remarks from you.
Mr. Venkatraman, you've spoken.
Yeah. Please leave.
So I'll just quickly summarize. This is a pragmatic budget, and I would say it's a growth-oriented budget. There have been some negatives, and I think one negative which is there at least from the market's perspective, is about this recapitalization or capitalization of public sector banks. But apart from that, I think it was more to do with the expectations that most market observers are having. And on a very lighter note, I can just share with you that most people in the market were expecting STT to be waived off, long-term capital gain, which is already zero, short-term capital gain get reduced, dividend distribution tax to be reduced, and so on and so forth. So that kind of expectations is difficult to manage, and that is, I think, a reason why there is some kind of unhappiness, quote unquote, with the budget. Otherwise, it's a practical budget. It lays out the roadmap. It lays out the roadmap for ease of doing business in India. Lays out the roadmap on what the government's thoughts on subsidies are. And overall, I think it's a good budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a pity that you have to leave.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on the infrastructure bit. Is the government taking on too much risk? Because when you talk about, completely financing infrastructure projects on your own, you're going to be taking on a huge amount of debt. Anyways, the government spends nearly a lot of percentage of their revenues on servicing debt. So are we putting too much at stake here?
Look, one, we do pay, I think it's now 60%, 70% of the fiscal deficit is interest payments. But if the funny thing about the deficits, right, is that if you get growth, your deficits go down, and if you will, interest rates are cut, your deficits go down. So I think certainly not with 70,000 crores, which is close to 3/4 of 1% of GDP that the center is planning to spend, is about a minimum that they should be spending. Because what we know, everybody has said, it doesn't matter whether it is from the Congress or even from the ARP. Maybe the ARP people don't think infrastructure is needed. They just think subsidies are needed. But you need infrastructure. It's sort of a sine qua non of any developing country that you need infrastructure. It's the most obvious thing. Infrastructure cannot be provided by the private sector alone. There's no place on the planet where infrastructure has been provided by the private sector. It is that the government sets it off, and there can be PPPs, this, that, whatever. But basically infrastructure, that's what the government is supposed to collect taxes for,
So I was
to spend on infrastructure and redistribution to the bottom half.
I was speaking with the road secretary. He was telling me what they're planning to do is that they are going to get a contractor who will build a certain stretch of road, and then they will sell that stretch of road as a product. So they're going to sell it as a product, and so the entire risk, the entire cost of cost of delays, overruns, everything is going to be absorbed by the government. And then depending on how long it takes for them to build that stretch of land or road, they're going to put it up as a product for sale, and then they're going to try and find buyers for it. And they're saying that's been done in other countries.
Only part.
Yeah, it is like a plug and play.
Yeah.
As a fact, it is that there's a lot of already, and throughout the last decade or so, where we had IDFC build the whole road and toll roads, etc., just from here to Gurgaon. So that is ongoing. As far as I know, it is not as if that all the roads that will be built will be built by the government as in the first stage. Yeah.
Sorry, just this thing that, so this actually allows the government to prioritize wherever it wants a network, it builds the network,
Right.
then it auctions it off. In case it doesn't get auctioned off, it still requires the road.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And if it gets auctioned off, you get the resources for some other investments.
So what does it do to our finances then?
That's already there. It's
already
3.9%
invested.
You need to put it in
You already
upfront.
have the hard
See,
infrastructure in place.
The government does not end up being long-term sort of owners of these assets.
Right.
So basically what they're trying to do is get pension funds, insurance companies, long-term providers of capital at lower cost. Once the risks are all taken out, it becomes like an annuity product. Just let them own it, right? And that allows the government to sort of recycle the capital,
Yeah.
take the risk that comes along with the development and construction activity, sort of remove all of those, and just give it to guys who are just looking for annuity returns. So that's what the plug and play and this kind of a model does actually. And so they're trying to open up the whole market to, of global insurance and pension funds, which is why you see so much talk about we want the global guys to come in and so on and so forth in this
Good
area.
questions.
You need to put a lot
inflationary is
in
the budget?
upfront.
How inflationary is the budget?
I wanted to address that actually. It just seems,
Dr. Ranade go?
where's my good friend Ajit?
I think he's made a rapid exit.
Can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, because the question was asked as to how inflationary is the budget, and I was going to respond to that, and I said you had brought it up, and so I wanted to make sure that you heard what I said. Look, why is it that everything has got to be, damned if you do and damned if you don't? Let me give you by an example, exactly on this inflation. Now, I don't believe in this, but the conventional wisdom is, by most people, that budgets are inflationary. Deficits are inflationary. That's what we've been taught. That Moody says this, and the Congress says this, and the BJP says this. अरे भाई, अगर आप यहाँ पे deficit को घटा रहे हो, तो भाई कैसे inflation आ गया? एक बात ये. दूसरी बात, the point is inflation is not from that I've increased the service tax by 1.5%. Inflation is a macro thing. There are a lot of other things that add a lot more to inflation or subtract a lot more from inflation than this. This is not even what is an appropriate metaphor? Not even a drop in the ocean as far as the inflation picture is concerned. So therefore, to think
Dr. Ranade?
that the raise in
Okay. Sure. Okay.
You can hear?
Welcome to Unified Conferencing.
He's going to reconnect. There's some trouble.
Yeah.
There. I think
okay.
it's back up.
So
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can
Sorry,
see.
Sujit, I just lost you for a couple of minutes. Can you just
yeah,
repeat what
no,
you said?
basically I said that look,
Crucial 2 minutes.
the inflation, and you had brought it up and whatever. And, bottom line being, to think that an increase in service tax is inflationary, or correspondingly that a decrease in service tax is deflationary, is I think completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter. There are a lot more things that cause inflation, there are a lot more things that decrease, but to think of service tax as causing it, but prior to that is something that we've
Sujit, I
discussed.
said a series of small things. The coal freight, all those things add up, not just one.
Urea freight,
Yeah,
railway
no,
freight.
that's the larger point I want to make. Then look, you have the prior point was, and I don't know whether you in particular subscribe to it, but a lot of economists subscribe to it, a lot of policymakers subscribe to it, that listen, budget, if you have a budget deficit, the larger the deficit, the higher the inflation. I think the RBI believes it. So let me not take you as a straw man. Let me take the RBI. Believes that the larger the deficit, the larger the inflation. There is no empirical relationship between the two. And in this case, by increasing the freight tax, by doing this, that, social service tax, you're decreasing the budget deficit. So, kya se hua? Damned if you do, damned if you don't, inflation aa jayegi. Inflation is
No,
not...
the quality of deficit, the quality of the deficit matters, quality.
Exactly. So I think the quality of the deficit in this case, by raising the service tax, moving towards the GST, which is a necessary thing. So I think the quality of this budget, in terms of this budget deficit, is the highest it's ever been.
Dr.
I'd like to-
Srivastava, would you like to add to that?
Let's also
Yeah.
respond to this. See, the RBI is one of the key players in this growth story, because if it cuts rates, you will have an impetus to growth. There's no argument on that, right? Now, what is it looking for? Well, I know. What is Raghu looking for? He says, let's see the government manage its deficit and things like that better. We want the right signal. That's what Sujit is alluding to right now. But he also says the main agenda, and this is something even in this budget, RBI's job is to target inflation. So here, the combination of rate increases, the combination of cesses, combination of service tax increase, all that actually has whatever inflationary impact, has an inflationary impact, and therefore it sends the wrong signal at a time when you actually want to go the other way. So why do it?
That's
What
why
is-
I'm objecting.
I'd like to just put this. I mean, at this point in time,
And these are administered prices, Mr. Gowda. These freight hikes are all they're not free market prices,
Correct.
as Sujit would like to believe.
at this point in time, you would like to allow the RBI enough leeway so that it does reduce the interest rates. Does this budget do that? And in short, it does not. It's not a matter of whether you've reduced it from 4.1 to 3.9, and I would agree with you. I mean, if you increase the taxes and reduce the deficits, it just one thing impacts the other. So that's not the issue. The critical point is, does the system today have enough liquidity to enable investment in the private sector? Does the system give enough signals to the RBI to reduce interest rates? And now that's where the subjective element comes in. There is this element, I think, and that Sujit is talking about, that yes, it does, but I really don't think that at this point in time, Mr. Raghuram Rajan can go ahead and start to reduce interest rates.
So you think that's
I think that's a very
ecosystem is not there.
important point.
Dr.
Yeah, that's
Srivastava,
it.
please feel free to come in.
Yeah, I think the point about inflation is that it is going to be cost push. Most of it will translate into administered prices going up, and therefore there is a signal, implicit signal, that inflation, there is an inflationary component in this. But I think that the broad point is that right now the inflation is actually heading downwards. In fact, WPI has gone into the negative zone. So the impact of these cost push factors would be quite incremental, and I think on balance we can absorb whatever might be the inflationary push. But the point that he raises about the quality of fiscal deficit, I think, is very critical, because while we are going down, this gets linked to your earlier point about the infrastructure spend that can come from the government directly, is that you have for the central government alone a limit of 3% of fiscal deficit, 3% of GDP. If the golden rule is actually achieved, that is to say the revenue deficit actually goes down, then all of that 3% would become available for infrastructure spend. And if you also bring in state governments into this, and if they continue to follow their fiscal deficit targets, then we will have 5.5% of the available fiscal deficit within the FRBM rules that may become largely available for infrastructure. So you start with a much larger fund for infrastructure coming directly from the government, and then you combine that with this idea of leveraging this by inducing private investors also to join this initiative, and then you can look for a much larger infrastructure funding, which is what would be required if we have to really meet our long-term story.
Right. Pro, you had another question, right?
Yeah, the other question that I had is, and this is where, because there is a slight divergence in views, is a lot more money going to the states or is it not? Because there seems to be a difference in the degree of money going to the states.
No, there is definitely not a lot more money going to the states. It was not the intention of the Finance Commission either. What has happened is actually, this has happened in two steps. First, in 14-15 itself, a lot of money which was being routed to the states but not through their state budgets. This was going to autonomous bodies at district level. That was actually put as part of a state plan last year. It had already happened before the changeover of the government. And this time, now that the Finance Commission recommendation has come, part of that is augmented state plan has been shifted to share in central taxes. So what has happened is the first step was increase in transparency. The second step is increase in autonomy of the states. But it is not as if the money has increased, the transfers have. In fact, what has happened is actually you might find that the transfers have gone down because the Finance Commission made the assumption of living with the base year in the Finance Commission calculations is the budget estimates of 14-15. That is the base year, and then 15-16 they have applied their growth rates. Now, that budget number itself is down by more than 110,000 crores. So, that number which was the base number for Finance Commission is down by 110,000 crores, and that assumption is going to be replicated for 5 years.
No, but wouldn't the states fight for getting the base realigned?
No, that calculation is over. So, the states cannot fight because the Finance Commission is not there to revise those assumptions, and therefore that.
In fact, the
Niti Aayog will come.
sorry, in fact,
No, Niti
Finance
Aayog, nothing.
Commission has made an assumption of 3% fiscal deficit. So that is very crucial to the projections.
Yeah, eventually.
3.6% this year.
Yeah. So, some of the Finance Commission assumptions which were critical for this projection path actually will have a multiplicative effect, because that 110,000 crores in the first year, that is going to be just multiplied.
You know, while we're on this number of 3.6 versus 3.9, the whole difference is 30,000 crores. I mean, एक वो सुट्टी को बेच देंगे वो 30,000 crores आ जाएगा. I mean, I'm serious. This is back in
So
the.
that means, so that's the reason why they should have stuck to like a cardinal, whatever, gospel, number should have been stuck to 3.6%.
No, I
That's
tend
exactly
to.
what I'm saying. Fiscal policy needs to be counter-cyclical, not pro-cyclical.
No, I tend to agree with Ajit. I think that 3.6 is something that they had only spelled out earlier. I mean, they had agreed to it when they agreed to 4.1, and they talked about going to 3.6 and 3%. And to deviate from it, which is a fundamental sort of change in their overall stance, just for 30,000 crores, to me, it sort of tests your credibility for not a lot of gain. And therefore, why do it? And I just felt that all of this justification with respect to spending on infrastructure and so on wasn't really substantive enough from my standpoint. I think they should have just, and that would have given them much more credibility with the rating agencies, with the RBI as well. And so therefore, it probably would have been better just to.
I think
go
they
with
bought
3.6.
breathing room.
Yeah, the upside was huge. Sumant, I agree. The upside would have been huge because I believe there was an internal debate between the PMO camp and the Jaitley camp. This is, of course, a hearsay. I have no evidence. But so this would have been, the upside would have been huge that despite all this pressure, you stuck to 3.6%. And the answer to Prasanjit was, according to the budget documents on the Finance Ministry website, the number is 37. It's gone up from 36% to 37%, the devolution to states out of total spending.
So when we talk about this budget being much more transparent, much more clear, when we start looking at these numbers, what's hidden, the assumptions, etc., then the picture becomes something totally different. And so you want
Only
to
because of the Finance Commission stuff.
Huh?
No,
Well, on the finance, but that's exactly
no, but that
where.
just came into the picture. I think it's
No, but
unfair to say it's. I think so. Seriously.
No, look at the stories.
Look, there are 5 different people, and all 5 are seeing the elephant in different ways.
No, that's right.
And I don't think
And
it's
the
a matter
elephant
of
is flying.
transparency.
The elephant
It's not
is
a matter of
apparently
transparency.
flying.
It's where we don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. Neither do I. I'm just saying that, the finance minister went on TV before the budget and said, we are making this dramatic announcement of devolution, thanks to accepting the Finance Commission's numbers, the new numbers. And then they also said, we are cutting down on all these social sector spending because the states are going to do it. And now we are concerned whether there's actually new money for that. If it turns out that we meet here 1 year later and we find that inflation has gone up as a result, if these amounts have not reached the states and are not being spent, what are we going to say? We're going to take back all our words and say, my God, we were like really, we pulled a fast one, right? And so that's one concern that I have. And
Tell me, this 62% or this 42% is of the gross tax receipts, right?
Yeah.
And why has that number?
Which excludes cesses and surcharges.
Fair enough.
The states don't get that.
I understand. But in some senses, that is additional revenue that the center is raising for itself. It is still giving more to the states, because the gross tax proceeds, as they were defined earlier, that definition has not, it may have got something added on
No, but
to it.
as he said, there are some parts will
Yeah,
be
but
cut
let
to
me,
them.
Sumant, let me clarify that.
Some parts
Sorry.
will be cut to them.
The 42%, hello, this of the total tax collected by the central government, 42% will now go back to the states. Additional 5% will go through the plans and assistance, which is still called plan assistance, so that makes it 47%, which is what Jaitley referred to repeatedly. Of the total taxes collected in the country, including Government of India and the VAT at the state level, 62% of those go back to the states. But it still doesn't, cover the entire spending of the central government. That
Spending
number
is a different matter,
but is 37.
but Ajit, spending is a different matter.
I think we are
Yeah.
being very unfair to this government. I
Yeah.
think the most critical part of the fiscal federalism is not that greater amounts be given, but that greater amounts of untied funds be given. The fact is that this is untied. So whether the states allocated to health, education, XYZ, etc. is not
Or gold
important.
under temples.
Yes, it can do whatever. But the most important part is that this government has appreciated, has taken on the task of fiscal federalism. These are untied funds. So you cannot say that they will allocate them to health or education or anything else, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
The state's government's prerogative.
Absolutely.
So I think we must
Absolutely,
not
I
be.
agree.
And I do agree with this 30,000 crores. It's not really an important part of it, but it's just the signals that are sent. So the government is fairly clear on this thing, and the signal it is sending, the way I see it, is that I'm going to go ahead with transparency. If it's 10 or 20 or 30,000 crores plus or minus, it's not important. So I think that's also a very good thing. So I do see that not meeting the target is actually a very positive thing. It's better than fudging the numbers and making it seem that they are going to meet 3.6 and not in the end meeting it, right? So so I would see all of this as a positive.
I want to add that what Laveesh is saying. This is purely in the nature of speculation. Okay, that come the year, that I think, so I have no knowledge, nothing, that I wouldn't be surprised if they do achieve 3.6.
Exactly, they might.
They want to say that we've done better than what we promised. I really believe that. That's part of their strategy. Exactly this. You say we will reach 3.9, then they lose 3.6. We कह देंगे कि हम देखो, we're back on track.
No, but
that
you
is,
lose.
we won't know that.
But you lose that 1 year credibility.
I don't
no?
think so. That's
In
why
fact, they've gained credibility.
They've gained.
You're being transparent.
That's
It's better to do that
I
than
mean,
to
it's-
fudge
no,
for
No,
the
the
executive
point
numbers.
It's a
is, but
strategic game. It's a
what they should have
strategic
had is transparency and a lower target.
No, it's a
Now,
strategic
you have a higher target and you have transparency, that's great.
Yeah, it's always, no, all I'm saying
Yeah.
is this is political thinking on the part of the government, which I like. However, if now next year it comes out to be 4.1, then I will be right in front of you say this was stupid and that they shouldn't have. But if they do get it, then I think it's good thinking. It's good political thinking, political economy, not to do with economics.
I
It's
think
political
the
economy.
chances of missing that target of 3.9 is very high because of the very optimistic revenue growth assumptions that the government has made. Now what has happened is that they are having missed all the revenue targets that they had budgeted last year. They are now assuming a growth in service tax and union excise duties of close to 25%. 25% growth. This translates into a buoyancy, assumed buoyancy of 2.2. Achieved buoyancy is 0.75 in these taxes last year. So, when inflation is low and inflation actually is falling, to assume a very high buoyancy when these taxes are very largely ad valorem actually puts tremendous doubt whether this is something that is going to really transpire. And if they miss on this target, there will be tremendous pressure on the fiscal deficit once again. But what would justify this kind of buoyancy? Is it this just additional, the union excise duty from 12.36 to 12.5 or service tax from 12.36 to 14? Is that enough to justify this kind of revenue growth that is there? And if this is also missed, the same story will be repeated as last year. Your base numbers will go down and will keep struggling. And therefore, if we talk about transparency, which when enforced by the Finance Commission is okay, but when you are building it, all of it in, must be justified as to what is it that will lead to this kind of growth in revenues.
I mean, looking at the numbers, and I haven't, but I plan to, a lot of the tax buoyancy has to come from assumptions about economic growth. So, not from inflation. Exactly what you're saying. You're not going to have much inflation regardless of the fiscal deficit or whatever it is, that it has to come from assumptions of economic growth.
Yeah,
And,
we
you know,
discussed that. The
and that's
growth,
the, whenever
growth
you have
assumption
a sharp
8.5.
upswing,
Sorry.
Yeah.
whenever you have a sharp upswing in growth, when you're coming out from a low consolidated base, you do get huge elasticities. So maybe they should have been conservative, not factor in, but I don't think it's unrealistic based on, if it is based on growth, which I think it is. So
But my concern is only this, that we know whatever may be the issue about the level of growth, whether that 7.4 is okay, 8.3, 8.5 is okay or not. The increment in growth that they are planning is 1 percentage point.
So it's also the
For
sectoral-
that you need an additional investment rate of 4 percentage points. So from 31, 32, this must go to 30.
That's
But,
not-
but year on year there are fluctuations.
and
in that.
also one
At-
last one, that I had to make that point. Look, the lot of the capacity about is not being utilized. So maybe they don't need any additional investment to get that 1% extra growth,
You have
because you're going to have an improvement in capacity utilization.
You have to generate demand for that. Now
Demand external
demand,
demand,
where
So
from?
I have looked at the numbers.
Export
I
is
have looked
growing
at
at
some-
0 rate.
Sorry. So I've looked at some of the numbers. I can't claim to have looked at all. And I do think that given the fact that there has been a spectrum sale, given the fact that there are going to be some reforms that are ongoing in the financial sector, at least on the service tax front, they're going to actually make those assumptions quite well. The problem will happen on the manufacturing side. But provided you have coal and the power sector and so on working, I mean, you may just be able to manage that as well. So I think on that, and that is why I was saying I was quite happy with the transparency in the numbers. Because it's not necessarily the overall growth rate that matters, because if it's the unorganized sector that you're dependent on the growth on, or the government sector, then you necessarily do not get these kind of numbers on the revenue side. But you can if it's in the telecom, financial, perhaps manufacturing or infrastructure sectors. So that's why I do think it's achievable.
Any game changer in this budget? A game changer for the Indian economy, if we were to identify one or two maybe.
I thought I identified 7.
Let's do one or two.
Different game.
So one thing that that is getting me, makes me optimistic is the recognition of the unorganized, the informal sector, which has not been done so far. It creates like over 100 million jobs. And there are countries that consider the informal sector as illegal, and until now no policies have really reached this sector. So could this be a potential game changer? You're talking about empowering the guy at the grassroots level who's trying to run a small business, who's creating jobs, who's now going to get finally will have an ecosystem to.
So maybe we should start with Mr. Sinha because he needs to leave.
Sure. Yes, let's start with you.
So you mean in terms of the unorganized sector, anything?
Informal sector, yeah.
Unincorporated sector.
You know, I can just sort of think back to the same thing we said about starting new businesses. You know, where the FM talked about here, there'll be some sort of regulated guidelines, and as long as you follow those, you can set up a new business. But that was more with respect to sort of encouraging, startups. I think more in the e-commerce space than necessarily on a more broad-based level. So I don't know if there's anything else.
So
No, there
if
is
you
this-
could
there
identify
is-
a game changer, do
No,
you
no,
think
there's
there's a game
one.
changer?
There's one on that front. This new Mudra Bank,
Mudra Bank is
right, which
specifically
is
for
focused
that.
on,
Yeah.
say, Dalit entrepreneurs
Right.
and NBFCs, and giving them some sort of cushion so that they can lend more.
Yeah.
You know, in that sense, it's sort of targeted at groups that have not historically had an opportunity to become entrepreneurial, and so in that sense,
Do these special banks actually work?
They've never worked before.
This is what I think. If you're looking for a Congress element in this policy, the Mudra Bank is very much the Congress
which
element.
we invite, so you can see me, we'll be quite happy.
So there were these women's banks, there's SCS.
No wonder.
So the only
But
one
yeah,
that
I
you are
think-
supporting is the one that the rest of the panelists think won't
No,
work.
no, next बोला चिदम्बरम ने वुमेन्स बैंक कर दिया,
Yeah,
एक
exactly.
सदारों के लिए बैंक कर दो, एक somebody who's going bold उसके लिए बैंक कर दो. क्या यार?
Okay, if they need, we will. That's if it
So
makes
in
an
terms of
impact.
game changers, look, I think there aren't, there's not any one thing that you can point to, and that is why if people have an objection with this budget is, they say it's not a big bang budget because there's not that one central defining idea behind it. But as Ajit said, it's got a lot of, and as we've all talked about it, There are lots of different little things that when you add them all up, it makes the ease of doing business a lot better going forward. And I think that's really where the focus has been, on just trying to debottleneck different sectors of the Indian economy and just make it easier.
On that, I challenge anybody here, anywhere, including Mumbai, to name me one central idea, big bang idea that we can have, other than freeing up agriculture. There isn't any. They're all incremental, if you will, improvements. And in that sense, I think it's very unfair, big bang budget. You cannot have a big bang budget in an economy. You could have it in 1991, but not now.
That's exactly what the economic survey did. That said that it is because, first of all, India is not under any economic or financial crisis right now. Secondly, the power is diffused vertically and horizontally, as I said, vertically between states and the center, horizontally between the government, the courts, the CAG. So in such a system, you can't have a decisive, game-changing push, and perhaps it's unadvisable. So you look at all this, that's why I call it choti bangs. Small things, but they're all potentially very important. And I agree with Shweta when you said universal insurance, social security, the focus on SMEs, the JAM, using the JAM for various, beneficiaries. I listed 5, 6 of them. So all of them are important individually. Cumulatively, they add up to something significant.
One quick question starting with Bombay. What will happen if there's a petrol crude price spike?
You want to start there?
Yeah. What will happen if there is a crude price spike?
Sure.
Of course.
So 5-10 minutes. We'll just wind up. That's last question. Yeah.
Sorry.
What will happen if there's a crude price hike?
Spike,
In what?
To the
Crude oil price.
So can I go first here? Can I go first? Because
that's what we had started with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to go first.
Yeah, given that the oil bounty was a big background factor to this budget, if the crude spikes back, and I think the chances are very low, then there will be a slippage on fiscal deficit. There may be a compromise on various spending ambition. But thankfully, according to me, the outlook for oil prices is to remain in the range of 60 to 65 for the next 12 months.
Okay.
I think I agree with that. 60 to 65 is the expected range. We don't expect any extreme spike. There may be some variation. If it were to increase much more beyond this, then of course it will have adverse impacts in the medium to long term for the Indian economy. The benefit of the crude oil price fall is actually going to come to the economy quite slowly. The first impact was that inflation went down, and therefore there is a revenue erosion. But as disposable incomes increase and overall prices of goods and services fall, demand from the private sector will increase, cost of production will go down, our competitiveness will increase, and therefore the benefits of the crude oil price collapse, as it were, are yet to really take off. They would slowly factor in. So at this time, a steady level of crude oil prices at around 60 to 65 would be very beneficial for the Indian economy.
I would just say that, look, the outside limit, beyond the outside limit of most people forecast, is for the oil to go to 80. And that itself is about a 25% reduction from the price that we had for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. So I think that's and we should expect the oil price to go up and down. And maybe, I agree with the general assessment that for it to go much beyond 60 is very difficult. But I'm saying even if it goes to 80, doesn't hurt us.
Okay.
So I do believe that they will harden, and but again,
Which is 60 is already 20% above what it is now.
So I do believe they will harden, and I do believe there will be the benefit that we got will reduce a bit. That doesn't mean that it will completely get eliminated. So that goodies or the laddu that we got will reduce in size, but not that
Laddu
much.
to laddu dayega.
So, but having said that, there will be some other effects that are happening globally, which are going to hit us not very positively. And I think we do need to have a low inflation climate. That's the only way to deal with international ups and downs.
Well, the reason why everyone was hoping for big bangs rather than choti ones is because that was the rhetoric of the election campaign. And, so essentially what we've got now is a huge viability gap between Mr. Modi's promises and Mr. Jaitley's delivery in the budget. How are you going to fill that? That's my question.
All right.
Next year, we'll all meet and we'll look at the numbers.
Yeah.
And then we'll say, just like petrol prices went up and diesel prices went up on the night of the budget, and said, you bakras, we'll show you. That's what we'll get in
I
a
think we
year's
should
time.
give, I agree there, we should give the government 1 year.
1 year.
No more.
So, okay, very quickly, some closing comments from everyone. Dr. Ranade,
Mine's done.
a closing comment from you.
Yeah, as I said, I just want to repeat what I said in the beginning, that actually in the conventional scheme of things, this budget would get an 8 out of 10. But given the huge expectations that were riding on this, even that was not good enough. So in a way, it's unfair to the finance minister because of competing objectives that he has to meet, and perhaps the game is really about expectation management, not so much the actual numbers. I think there are many positives in the budget, which I mentioned, but let me just again mention them again. Suffracy and combined with MSME is a very big thing. Universalizing, first step towards social security. I personally like the gold monetization very much. The big thing that was missed out, I think, is the undercapitalization of public sector banks and the very focused push to untangling the NPS, which I think is what is holding up private sector investment. That was the main thing. And the second one was perhaps we could have tried to keep the 3.6% promise because the upside is much more than the gain in going from 3.6 to 3.9. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Srivastava.
Well, I think it's a missed opportunity. If the government could have eliminated the difference between planned and non-planned expenditures, all this classification, this was the right opportunity, with the Finance Commission recommending that, along with all these other changes. And we know that we are going to live with a much smaller size of government as a whole, relative to what we need in terms of our education and health needs and so on. And therefore, whatever small size of government we have, we must efficiently use those resources. This whole distinction of non-planned plan is actually very inefficient. It actually emphasizes creation of incomplete assets and non-maintenance of completed assets. And therefore, if we are going to live with a relatively small size of government, we must become more efficient, and this is the first step that could have been taken. If not now, maybe by next year they would have the courage to take that up.
Okay, that's encouraging. Dr. Balla.
I think this budget is fundamentally revolutionary in the following very important sense. The first very important step has been taken to make India both I emphasize, a modern and a competitive economy. This is the major message of the budget. This is the major message of the Economic Survey. This is the major message of the Finance Commission. This is the major message of the railway budget. So we've got 4 different things, all pointing towards that, and the content of the budget should be looked at. I agree with the plan, non-plan. I think all of these things will come, but the first step has been taken towards a very competitive economy, which we'll have to be in this day and age in order to survive.
Okay.
So I think this budget needs to be seen from 2 different angles. The first is the top level angle, where the broad direction is being spelled out, and the broad direction is transparency, federalism, and greater investment. And I think the budget does a great job of all of these 3. At the second level is the implementation part, and here is, I think, where the budget does need. It seems that the people who drafted the vision could not look into the nitty-gritties long enough or deeply enough. So I think the budget does fall on the details, and hopefully next time the people who draft the vision would be able to take a look at the details.
Okay.
I do get another chance. Okay. I think one thing interesting about India is that from 1991, we've had lots of different governments come and go, right? And we've seen essentially a trajectory that is broadly maintained. liberalization, making the economy more modern and competitive and humane, right? So in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of programs focused on initiatives paying attention to people at the base of the pyramid, people who are being left behind by the growth story. And the good thing about this budget is, and this government's initiatives, is that it is continuing in those directions. We created sort of subsistence, survival incomes and food and things of that sort, food security, and now they're going to add the other dimensions that financial inclusion is all about, which is pensions and security and insurance and everything else. So you can see that I'm really glad that that has not been forsaken in this in this move to please the corporate sector.
Inclusive budget.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's going. I mean, we would take the credit for it and
Sure.
say they're continuing and building on what we did.
Okay.
But I'm happy about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you
Thanks.
everyone.